So what are the long-term prospects for the war in Ukraine? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Reiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So there are basically two schools of thought out there as to what's going to happen in the long run in Ukraine. One school of thought believes that Russia will continue to slowly grind its way to at least take control of the Donbass region in the east and the Black Sea ports, including Odessa in the south. I recently saw this school of thought expressed very eloquently by retired Major General James Spider Marks on CNN. And of course, as always, I'll link to the sources of everything I say down below. The other school of thought is predicting that ultimately the Ukrainians are on track to actually defeat the Russians. And that's the school of thought that President Biden seems to have taken and is most eloquently presented by Ambassador Michael McFaul. And again, I'll post a link to a video featuring him down below as well. The group who thinks that in the long run, Russia is going to take control of the eastern and southern sections of Ukraine believe that this will be the result of essentially a continuing grinding war, where Russia, at least in parts of Ukraine, will be facing an insurgency much like what it faced in Afghanistan. And that at a certain point here, the Ukrainians and the Russians are going to have to come to some type of understanding in which part of the Ukraine is ceded to Russia to essentially get them to back off. Now that resolution, by the way, would be devastating to Ukraine, because unfortunately some of these areas that the Russians covet also tend to be some of the wealthiest parts of Ukraine, where its incredibly rich soil is located, where they grow so much wheat they've become known as the breadbasket of Europe, and where they have a lot of natural resources in terms of minerals that can be mined there. And losing out on the Black Sea ports in the south would essentially make Ukraine a landlocked country which is unable to engage in trade with the rest of the world. So this end result would absolutely be devastating to Ukraine. And that's exactly what the Russians want, by the way. If they can't take the entire country, including Kyiv, and essentially replace Zelensky's government with one more to their liking, they'd be quite happy to take the eastern sections with its rich mineral deposits and agriculture, and the ports in the south. Now, to be sure, the Russians have continued advancing, for the most part, in Ukraine, albeit slowly. And as they've made gains, a lot of them have been taken back by the Ukrainians. But as of yet, although the Russian advance has been slow and ineffective, it has been still slowly grinding forward. And they do have, as we know, a lot of firepower that they can bring to bear to essentially lay waste to the areas that they're trying to take. But I have to say, I find myself siding with the other school of thought, which believes that ultimately Ukraine will be able to eject the Russian invaders, if not from the entirety of Ukraine, certainly from most of it. Now, why do I think that? Well, just compare the trajectories that the two countries' militaries are on right now. British intelligence just announced that they believe a quarter of Russia's invasion units are now combat ineffective. Now, this doesn't mean that they've been killed outright, but it means that they've suffered enough casualties that, in effect, they're unable to field a real combat force. Similarly, as the Ukrainians have been destroying Russian tanks and other material, the Russians are finding it harder and harder to replace these things. I mean, we have to remember the guts of a lot of the Russian smart weapons are actually made of American, Japanese, and European electronics, things that are now denied to them as a result of the sanctions. Furthermore, Russia is suffering a brain drain as successful, productive, educated young Russians are leaving the country out of outrage of how their government is behaving. And many of their most successful business leaders are cowering for fear of what Putin will do to them, especially after one of the few Russian self-made billionaires, Oleg Tinkov, criticized the Ukrainian invasion and essentially had the Putin regime step in and take away his fortune. And while it is true that the Russians may be able to engage in a general mobilization to essentially draft young people from across the country into the war in Ukraine, the deaths of their leadership is absolutely devastating and is irreplaceable. We just heard today that the 10th Russian general has been killed something that former American General David Petraeus said was unprecedented. And we also just heard that General Valery Gerasimov had to be evacuated from Ukraine and was seriously injured as a result of a missile attack. And the reason this is relevant is Gerasimov is actually the chief of the General Staff of the Army, the equivalent of the American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So literally, the highest position in the Army. These kinds of losses, along with the material losses, are absolutely irreplaceable. And in fact, what we're hearing is as trains are going from Russia into Ukraine to resupply the invasion, these trains are carrying material, some of which dates back to World War II era. So that's where the Russian military stands now, and it only continues to get worse. As time goes on and more generals get killed, and more senior officers get killed, and more of the military units are made combat ineffective, and more of this irreplaceable weaponry is being destroyed, and as we've seen, the Ukrainians start to actually bring the battle onto Russian soil, you're going to start to see a more and more ineffective Russian military. Contrast that with what's going on in Ukraine. Although Ukraine obviously has suffered horrible losses, by all accounts their military remains incredibly motivated and with incredibly high morale. What's more is as a result of their interaction with Western militaries, including the American one, they've developed a corps of non-commissioned officers, essentially sergeants, who are able to provide the battlefield leadership that is missing from the Russian military, and is the reason why Russian generals literally need to put themselves in harm's way to get their soldiers to essentially follow commands. What's more is that as the war has gone on, the United States and our allies have been more and more aggressive in sending more and more advanced weapons to Ukraine. Just today, we heard that a new drone called the Phoenix Ghost drone is being sent to Ukraine. This is a weapon that's so secret we literally don't know what it does. So literally, the Ukrainians are being sent the state-of-the-art of American military material right now. And this is on top of all kinds of other weapons that they've been asking for a long time, but haven't been getting. Things like, for example, the 155mm heavy howitzers, which are now being sent by the hundreds into Ukraine. And Soviet-era fighter jets, which we just heard Slovakia is sending a bunch into Ukraine, after it reached a deal with Poland to essentially patrol its skies. In other words, as time goes on, the Ukrainian military is getting stronger and stronger while the Russian one is getting weaker and weaker. In other words, while it's true that the Russians have been able to slowly grind forward in parts of Ukraine, we have seen that the Ukrainians will engage in counterattacks and make an effort to essentially take back territory that had been invaded by the Russians. And as a result, as the Russian military gets weaker and the Ukrainian one gets stronger, I think we're not going to see this war essentially settle into a stalemate. Instead, at some point, I think what we're going to see is a shift where the Ukrainians are going to start to be able to really push back the Russians. I think this is exactly the kind of analysis that President Biden is looking at when he's saying that he believes that the Ukrainians are going to be able to win this war against Russia, and why he was willing to commit an additional $33 billion in assistance to the Ukrainians. That's more than 10 times the amount of assistance that we've given Ukraine thus far, to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about. And last but not least, the Europeans are moving to cut back on their imports of Russian oil. And as they are importing less and less Russian oil, then that's going to mean that Putin has less and less money available to him to essentially keep his economy going while this invasion moves forward. This, again, while the United States has essentially said we're willing to write a blank check to support the Ukrainians. At this point, I would much rather be in President Volodymyr Zelensky's position than in Vladimir Putin's. Well, this success by the Ukrainians really owes a lot to the leadership of President Biden and his ability to really bring all our allies together in support of the Ukrainians. If you want to find out more about the leadership that he's provided, check out this video I did a little while ago. It's really been very impressive, the kind of foreign policy leadership that he's been providing. And it's really quite a contrast with what we'd seen with the prior guy. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.